Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining us. This is Linda Jackson speaking from Food Focus. Thank you so much for taking time out of your Wednesday morning to be with us. We have 40 people in the room, which is really great. We're expecting about 60. I'm sure there are a couple of people that are just quickly dashing to go and get a cup of coffee. So we're going to give them a few minutes to do that. In the meantime, I just want to make sure that everybody can hear us. Everybody hear me loud and clear. What's important is that if you can't, it's probably on your side. So won't you please make sure that you have checked your sound settings. Make sure that your computer is not on mute. Also, please make sure that if you have plugged in headphones for any reason, that you have made sure that you've selected those on the audio option. That often is what gives us a challenge when it's another pair of ears, but the computer doesn't know that you're wearing those other pair of ears. I sincerely hope that you are all well this morning, that wherever you may be, whether you are in lockdown, working from your home office, in your pajamas, or whether you are still at work and making sure that we in South Africa have food, for which we're very, very grateful to see you as our food safety heroes. We would like to welcome you with us this morning to the webinar. I'm going to commence the webinar. We had actually indicated that it would start at 10, but we've got, I think, the vast majority of people in the room with us. So I'm going to start the webinar and then we'll go straight into the session. And please, if you do have any Q&A, we'll have a bit of time at the end for you to ask those questions. It's always great to have Janusz on the line with us. So I'm going to just go through some of the housekeeping things for the presentation. I'm sure for most of you, it's not the first time that you're joining us. So please make sure that you appreciate the fact that if you can't see the full screen, won't you click on the little red maximize or minimize button, because that way you'll be able to see the full presentation. Please remember we are recording it. So if for any reason we drop connection, you drop connection during the course of the presentation, please don't panic. It is being recorded and you will automatically receive a notification once the recording is available. And once it's gone onto our website as the edited version, you'll also be informed. We'd like to hear from you. It's good to know that there are people out there that are still fighting the good fight. I'm sure for those of you that are working in lockdown, if you are working from your home office, although we can have as many virtual meetings as possible, the need to have connection is really important for all of us. So why don't you drop us a line in the chat window, just so that we can have a shout out from you, so that we can say hi. It's always important to remember that although we are working, we're still humans and we actually need to have community. If you have any questions relating to today's presentation, please won't you pop them into the chat bar as well, and we'll handle those at the end of the session once Janusz has been through his presentation. We do have a full hour with him, and so you're welcome to pose those questions in relation to the webinar. If there is anything related outside of the webinar, I'm sure Janusz will be happy to try and answer that for you as well, provided we have time. So thanks very much for that. I see that there are some comments coming in already. Anthony, thanks. Hi, it's great to have you. Stefan, thanks for the shout out. It's lovely to have you in the room with us. For the rest of you, please keep keep sending through your comments and your questions as we go through the webinar today. I think for most of us, the presenter today doesn't need too much of an introduction. We know him and we love him because he's a regular contributor to Food Focus. Janusz, thank you for always making time to chat to us. Thank you for always making time to help us to understand the complexities of the legal requirements. For those of you that may not know Janusz that well, he represents an organization called Hahn Hahn. They are a boutique law firm. Janusz is in fact a partner at the firm, and one of their specialities is food law. In fact, if you actually look out for Janusz's car driving around on the highways, look out for the food law GP number plate and make sure that he's not speeding. That is, of course, when we're not in lockdown. So Janusz, thank you so much again for being with us. Without further ado, I'm now handing over control of the mouse and the presentation to you. We look forward to hearing all about the implications of COVID-19 and Regulation 638.
Good morning, everybody. I hope you can hear me. Maybe Linda can just let me know if everybody can hear me.
Yep, can hear you loud and clear. Thanks, Janusz, and you have control of the mouse.
Thank you so much. So, just to start off, I think it's important. Oh, the slide is not moving. That's
no problem.
Let me go.
There we go. Got it for you.
One more up. Okay,
there we go.
So I think just to start off, look, we are living in extremely unusual times. You know, law is usually something that is, to a large extent, slow and considered. Regulations are published in draft, they go out for comment, the comments are considered, then there are more comments, then eventually regulations are promulgated. Usually there's a long period before they come into effect. Now, all of that has gone out the window for obvious reasons, and we are being bombarded daily with change. First of all, with us starting off with the actual Disaster Management Act and regulations, and then initially at least almost daily changes to those regulations as the unintended consequences of some of the regulations became apparent. I still think there are many, some would say unintended consequences, others would say intended consequences. There are many differences of opinion on interpretation of some of the regulations, but we have what we have and we have to make the best of it. The reality is that there's probably not a single answer to some of the questions. So over the last couple of weeks, I've been faced with quite a number of questions from food companies, starting with, can they sell hot food in a supermarket, because in one city police are closing down supermarkets, but yet in many others hot food continues to be sold. So there are many such questions, and one can read a regulation and give it an interpretation, but that doesn't mean that somebody else would give it the same interpretation. And especially in the times we live in, that person interpreting the regulation may be a police constable or a soldier that has no legal background and in fact may not have such a great grasp of the English language, may not be able to interpret the regulation correctly. So just understand, as I'm explaining today and as I'm talking today, who will be interpreting some of the regulations which have come out under the Disaster Management Act. As regards R638, there the situation has not changed. In other words, that still falls under the EHPs, although the EHPs are under huge pressure at the moment because there's been guidelines issued to EHPs as to what their duties are during this time of COVID-19. And those duties, if one reads through the multi-page document that was issued, enforcement of R638, I don't even recall it being on that list. They have much more urgent matters to deal with, such as public health, really public health, as in dealing with the public, dealing with mortuaries, dealing with cleaning of public spaces. So also understand that although R638 is still going to be enforced by EHPs, it may take a bit of a back burner to some extent. The Department of Health has made it clear that food safety is not negotiable, and that obviously in these times that we live in, food safety is actually more important than ever, because if people are already going to be ill from the virus, the last thing they need is to have a food poisoning case on top of that. Okay, so excuse for the very long introduction, but I thought it's quite important just to get a good background as to what are we dealing with today, and to some extent what colors the presentation that I'm going to give. And I think I should add one more thing, and that is that the business model of South Africa has changed. Food deliveries have become really important, and I'm not talking about fast foods, QSRs. We're talking here about ordering your daily groceries. So the issue of food deliveries and how R638 deals with that is also very important. we all realize that a person delivering food to you could in fact be transmitting the virus. Having said that, in other times, non-COVID-19 times, that same food delivery person could also be transmitting, for example, a foodborne disease. All right, so let's start with the presentation. Just want to get the slide to go down.
I'll take it.
It's not
no problem.
Reacting. There we go. All right, so let's start off with the Disaster Management Act and how it applies to labor, in other words, employees and the Department of Labor. So when you have a business, we are talking today to the food industry, but obviously you've got the following issues that have to be considered. The one is public transport of workers. Your employees have to get to you, and there's obviously a risk element from a contamination or transmittal of virus perspective. There's the requirement for physical distancing. You'll note I don't call it social distancing, physical distancing, and that obviously applies to public transport of workers, but applies in all respects in public spaces, but as well as in the work environment. There's the use of masks in public spaces, and I will talk about PPE specifically a bit later in the workplace. This is wearing of masks in public spaces. And of course, one has to consider that that person who wore the mask in the public space now comes into the workplace and they are wearing this mask. What happens? Do they take it off? What do they do with it? How do they handle it? I'm not specifically going to deal with that, but these are things you need to consider. And then, of course, the whole issue of hand hygiene, sanitization, washing of hands, and so on. So those things are being dealt with under disaster management globally, not specifically with your business. It applies to everyone. Next slide. There we go. So the Department of Labor issued this document, which tries to inform you in running your business on a hazard and risk identification in the time of coronavirus. Now, obviously, the hazard and risk identification applies at all times under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, but there are specific issues that have to be considered and some which can't be considered in the instance of the virus. So, for example, if one looks at the top, you'll see elimination. Now, whereas in a normal work environment, you might be able to eliminate a risk, it's not possible for you to eliminate the virus. Replacing the infectious agent with something else, well, obviously in your case or in the case of the world at the moment, that is not an option. The virus is there and we have to live with it. But there are hazard and risk identification issues which must be considered. Some are considered administrative, some are behavior modification, the right attitude of staff, appropriate training, etc. Engineering the environment, for example, ensuring that there's sufficient distancing between employees, that their workstations are possibly moved around wherever possible so that people are spaced apart far enough so there can't be infection by a worker who may have been infected but is not yet reflecting any symptoms of another worker. And then, of course, the wearing of protective personal equipment. And there is some debate around it, but I think the government has now simply said, look, wearing of masks has become essential. Now, if wearing of masks is essential in public places, I think it'll be very difficult to argue that it's not essential in a work environment where you're working with other people. Why would it be a lower risk inside a work environment than in the street? So this is how one has to decide what are the risks to employees. So this is to do with employee health, employee well-being. So that had nothing to do with R638. That was to do with labor and employee and, in fact, general public health. And that is what the new regulations, the new thrust of everything that's happened since 20 March or 16 March or whenever all of this started, feels like a lifetime ago, but that's how long it can be recent. It's true. You know, we caught up in this. We think we've been dealing with this for a very long time. Yes, but anyway, but we mustn't forget that some of the laws and regulations we had in place already, although they don't name coronavirus, clearly deal with infectious diseases and risks of contamination, etc., etc. So R638, which obviously came into effect not that long ago, but it's less than 9 months ago or 10 months ago now, and which I've spoken about recently and on several occasions, I think looking at what is the purpose of R638 in our coronavirus world, we need to understand the following, and that is that R638 is primarily concerned with public health issues, which obviously the Disaster Management Act, etc., also is concerned with. It relates to the production, distribution, and retailing of foodstuffs. It relates to the food safety and hygiene at such premises. And very importantly, it relates to the obligations of the person in charge at such premises. And here's the kicker, and the food handlers and any delivery drivers associated with those premises. Now, the delivery drivers thing has become more and more important during the coronavirus outbreak. But of course, it has in fact applied all along. It just possibly people haven't thought about it all that much. Whereas now it's become critical, as I suppose it's become the primary means by which many people actually get their groceries. So the other law we need to think about briefly is the Occupational Health and Safety Act. And under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, staff safety issues are primarily regulated. And this law deals with the safe working environment and obligations of the employer and employee to provide and maintain safe working environment to all employees. Now, please note, it creates obligations for the employer and the employee. It's not a one-way thing. So once the employer has met their obligation and provided the safe working environment, it becomes the obligation of the employee to maintain that safe working environment and take the steps required to ensure that the safe working environment is there for all their fellow employees. Now, that hazard chart that I showed you really fits in here, because if for the employer to provide and maintain a safe working environment, they need to go through that process in that chart, which I showed right in the beginning. So getting back to R638, and I'll briefly deal with the Occupational Health and Safety Act towards the end. So as you all know, R638 requires that you have a COA for premises and that food may not be handled or permitted to be handled unless you have a valid COA. And very importantly, this applies to any outsourced vehicle used for the transport of perishable food on behalf of a person in charge of a food premises. And obviously, you cannot operate in contravention of any restriction. So not only the premises, but also the vehicles require to be compliant with this regulation. So who has this obligation? Who has the responsibility to ensure in this time of coronavirus that you're not contributing to the spread of the virus through your food business, as opposed to necessarily inside your food business? So I'm only picking on a few of the obligations in terms of R638. As many of you know, R638 creates a lot of obligations for the so-called person in charge of food premises. And just to remind or to inform those who have not heard my presentation before, when you get a certificate of acceptance of premises, acceptability of premises, a person's name and ID number appears on that certificate, and that person is the so-called person in charge. They are ultimately responsible for ensuring that R638 is complied with, and therefore food safety and hygiene is complied with. So that person in charge must ensure at least the following. Number one, that the regulations are complied with. Very broad statement. That person must ensure all of R638 is complied with. 11 is a very important one. That person in charge must ensure that a condition, act or omission that may contaminate food does not arise or is not performed or permitted on the food premises. So that's an important function. It's a very broad one again. Number 12, the person in charge must ensure that persons under his or her control and we will talk a little bit about who those people are, who handle food at all times, meet the standards and requirements and execute the duties prescribed by Regulation 9 and 11. So as the person in charge, you must ensure that the people, the food handlers, at all times meet the standard and requirement in the regulation I'm going to explain in a minute. And secondly, that those people execute all their duties in accordance with Regulation 9 and 11. So there is an enforcement aspect of this person in charge. And then finally, a very important one, that the reporting of diseases and conditions contemplated in Regulation 11.2b, which I will explain on, are properly recorded and kept for perusal by an inspector. So from the coronavirus perspective, I think these are probably the four most important obligations. Don't get me wrong, you still have to comply with all the others as you always would, but these are the ones which I think are most relevant to the issue we have on the table today. And that is dealing with a virus which is not necessarily a foodborne disease, but can be spread through people. So let's look at the food handler. So the food handler may not handle or be allowed to handle food without wearing suitable protective clothing as specified. Now, we need to understand that there's been a lot of debate up to now about what is required PPE. Should they wear gloves? Shouldn't they wear gloves? Should they wear masks? Shouldn't they wear masks? I would like to think that the question of masks is done. With the Department of Health requiring everybody to wear masks, it would be absurd that you would be required to wear a mask in the street, but not in a food factory. It just wouldn't make any sense to me. Maybe you can argue that with me, but I just think logic dictates that if it's a requirement to wear a mask in a public space, it must equally be a requirement then to wear a mask in a working environment where you're working with other people who you could infect. Let's forget about the food stuff for a minute. So some of the issues which have come up, and Professor Lucia Annelich has given webinars on this, and I've listened to other international speakers. And the question is it possible to transmit the virus in food? Please note the word there, in food. And I think most people have concluded that the virus is not transmittable in food. Another question which comes up is the wearing of protective clothing, especially gloves and masks. The gloves one, I still agree with Professor Annelich and other speakers that cleaning your hands regularly and sanitizing them is probably better than wearing gloves. But the mask issue, as I said, I think is done. I think there is now a requirement nationally to wear a mask. And then finally, we need to remember that although the food cannot be transmitted, although the virus cannot be transmitted in food, it is clear that the virus can survive for at least several days on packaging, crates, vehicles used to transport food, and any other surfaces. There are time periods from 24 hours to 7 days that I've seen in scientific publications. But the virus can survive on surfaces. If a food handler has the virus, doesn't know or may know, and is packing something, and then, or is a delivery person handling the product and then transferring it to a customer, it is possible that the virus can be transmitted through the packaging rather than through the foodstuff. And hence, a person may not handle or be allowed to handle food without wearing suitable protective clothing. Remember what has been said is that in order to help prevent spread of this virus, we need to consider everybody as potentially infected. And that way you can stop the virus. Looking at Regulation 11.2 specifically, it says, food, a facility or a container may not be handled by a person who has reported or who is suspected of suffering from or being a carrier of a disease. So very importantly, this is that 11B that I referred to in my previous slide, where I said that the person in charge has an obligation in respect of a person who has a disease mentioned in this regulation. So, a facility or a container may not be handled by a person who is reported or who is suspected of suffering from being a carrier of a disease in its contagious stage, likely to be transmitted through food, and which includes diarrhea, fever, sore throat with fever. There are some other symptoms that they list, but it's a list separated by commas. So those ones that I've left on the list are in fact some of the symptoms by which you can identify someone that's got COVID-19. So it's really important that this regulation actually already deals with the coronavirus outbreak, even though coronavirus wasn't known at the time the regulation was written. It then says that a person referred to above may only resume handling food, a facility, or a container if the person submits a certificate by a medical practitioner stating that they are fit to handle food. So it's not sufficient to send someone home, tell them to self-quarantine for 14 days, and then they can come back to work. They cannot come back to work. If they have been sent away under B1, they cannot come back to work until they have a certificate from a medical practitioner stating that they are fit to be back at work to handle food. And as I said, the risk is probably not that the virus will be in the food itself, but it's in the handling of the food, the handling of the facility, the handling of the container, that some of the surfaces may become contaminated, and then the virus may spread. So from the point of view of the person in charge of premises, they have to be on the lookout for any person exhibiting any of the symptoms, i.e. diarrhea, fever, sore throat with fever, and they are not allowed to handle any food. In fact, they shouldn't be on the premises. You need to immediately send them in accordance with the Department of Health to the relevant place, clinic, etc., so they can be diagnosed or at least evaluated and tested if necessary. And you can only permit them to return to work when they have a doctor's certificate that they are fit to return to work, not when some period of time has passed. You know, this may change, and the reason is it's internationally, they're now starting to see that some people are in fact only displaying symptoms much longer than 14 days after initial infection. But as we stand at the moment, if someone is told to self-quarantine for 14 days, they shouldn't return to work until they've then been tested and said they can return to work. All right, but we need to understand a few definitions. So in R638, there are several definitions which are very important. So first of all, what is a food handler? You know, people think a food handler is the person that actually picks up the fruit and puts it in a box, or which mixes ingredients or takes a product and puts it in packaging. But let's have a look what the law says. So a food handler in terms of R638 on the food premises directly handles or comes into contact with packaged or unpackaged food. So somebody handling already packaged food, let's say in a warehouse, in a retailer, is a food handler. If they are touching food equipment, if they are touching utensils, if they are touching food contact surfaces, in all of those cases, they are food handlers, even if the food is packaged. Very important. But we need to understand what is a food premises, because now we know what a food handler is. But in terms of these regulations, what is the definition of food premises? And obviously the one everybody thinks of, well, it's your building, it's your factory, it's your shop. But in fact, it goes further. So it can be a building, a structure, a store, or other similar structure. But very importantly, it includes a caravan, I suppose a food truck, a vehicle. Now, vehicle includes many things. There's a definition of vehicle in the regulations, which I didn't bother to cut out, but I mean, you can imagine. It includes a motorcycle, it includes a car, it includes a truck, it includes many things. A stand or place used for or in connection with the handling of food. So food premises definitely includes your factory, your shop, a store, all of those things, but it also includes a vehicle. So a person handling food for delivery in a vehicle is in fact regulated by R638. So vehicle packers, delivery vehicle drivers, and delivery staff are all food handlers. And the person in charge of the premises will need to understand this and ensure compliance with R638. So who is responsible to ensure this in respect of people like drivers and packers? Because obviously, every person in charge knows that they are responsible for the actual employees in the facility, preparing the food, packing the food, handling ingredients, and so on. But who is dealing to ensure that the drivers and packers are actually compliant with R638? And what one needs to understand is that if there was suddenly a hotspot, like we had at the St. Augustine's Hospital in KZN recently, and it turned out that some company doing deliveries was the cause of a hotspot, and suddenly a lot of people to whom products had been delivered were infected because of lack of controls at that company, it would be a disaster. For starters, they would be shut down immediately, just like they did with the hospital in KZN. If they can shut down a hospital, they can shut you down, take my word for it. So it's really important that one deals with this very important issue. Okay. So in terms of subregulation 14, a vehicle delivering prepackaged food owned by the same owner as the food premises may be included in the COA of the food premises, and therefore the person in charge of the food premises is responsible. In plain language, you're a retailer, you own your own delivery vehicles. The people who drive those vehicles are your employees. The people who pack the vehicle at the shop, or the guys who walk around with a trolley in the supermarket, are your employees. You are fully in control. You are fully responsible for the employees, the vehicles, the whole supply chain. In fact, that's the easier one to deal with. But where a third-party vehicle is involved, that third-party vehicle would need a certificate of acceptability in the name of the person in charge of the delivery vehicles. Now, that may be an individual. Some companies are outsourcing deliveries to just a man and his dog, I wanted to say, a man and his motorbike. Other companies have a fleet. And the reality is that nonetheless, someone has to be responsible. That vehicle, whether individually owned or whether owned as part of a fleet, must fall under a COA, and the person in charge, named on the COA, is responsible for compliance with R638 and to ensure that everything I've said so far is complied with. So it's not so in fact, using an outsourced supply chain can become more onerous, because you, as the company that produces the food or retails the food, need to ensure that the third-party people you are using actually are complying with the regulations. I need to just differentiate something very briefly, and without getting into a long debate, and that is this. There are various models for delivering foodstuffs, as there were always pre-corona when people would order takeaways. The one model is you go on your app and you order from a delivery company. That delivery company goes and buys the meal at a restaurant or at a QSR, and they therefore are the customer of the QSR, and you are the customer of that delivery company. In that instance, the QSR doesn't need to know whether the delivery company has a COA or not, because it's just a customer. The man walking through the door with a helmet, he's actually a customer. The fact that he's delivering it to someone else is of little relevance. But where the model is that you are outsourcing your delivery, in other words, the order is placed and you are getting a third-party delivery company in to come pick it up and deliver it, it is very much your concern, and you need to ensure compliance. So, jumping back to the Occupational Health and Safety Act, the OHSA Act regulates the safety of the employee, i.e. the food handler, for example. And that food handler could be somebody like the driver, the delivery person, etc. Obviously, there are many other employees. I'm just focusing on the one now. The employer has an obligation where reasonably practicable, to provide and maintain a safe, healthy work environment that is without risk to employees. Now, again, that slide I showed you with the risk analysis and what steps can be taken is in fact a very important one. If something should go wrong, they will evaluate you and what you did against that chart. Is what you did reasonable? Obviously, you are not, you can't have your drivers driving around in hazmat suits like spacemen, but there certainly are reasonable practical steps that you can take to ensure that your employees are healthy. Bearing in mind that if your employee does not become infected, he won't infect your customers. So although the Occupational Health and Safety Act clearly deals with an employer-employee relationship, in the case of the food industry, it has a huge knock-on effect onto public safety, the safety of the consumer. And employees need to be properly educated about the risks they are exposed to and what precautionary measures are to be taken. In the last couple of weeks, I have ordered groceries and supplies from various retailers on various platforms. I have had on the same platform a driver arrive here with what looked like his private car, didn't look like a delivery vehicle, with absolutely no idea of any safety. He had no sanitizer, he had no mask, he had nothing. He simply got out, he wanted to hand me the bags. I made him put them down a distance from me and walk away from them before I went to pick them up. And yet that same company, on a different occasion, a driver came who was very fastidious. He first sterilized his hands before he took the bags out the car. So clearly there's either a lack of widespread education amongst the drivers that are being used, or some of the employees are simply ignoring the advice they're being given. And that's what the last point on my slide is that the employee also has an obligation to maintain the safe working environment. Now, when this will come to the fore is when the you-know-what hits the fan. Because when there's suddenly a problem, and then an increase or a hotspot, or whatever you want to call it, is suddenly linked back to somehow back to your supply chain, you would then have to show as an employer that you had done what you can in terms of providing proper training, proper safety equipment. And it's in fact the employee himself who's at fault because he has chosen to ignore what you had in fact told him to do and shown him what to do. So going back to R638 then, sorry, I've gone the wrong way, sorry. There we go. So what is the conclusion? This is actually the last slide. So what is the conclusion? So the conclusion on COVID-19 and R638 is that the person in charge for food premises, whether that be the producer or retailer, has an obligation to ensure that production and deliveries from their premises are carried out in a safe manner and in accordance with R638. Where their own vehicles are used for delivery, they are in charge and have the obligation. Where deliveries are outsourced, the outsourced vehicle must either have its own COA or be on the COA of the owner-operator of the vehicles. Now, from my point of view, I think that the whole COVID risk actually lies at this end of the supply chain. As I say, world experts have said that food itself is not a victim for coronavirus. So the risk itself does not lie, as I understand it, in the production of the food. Even if a person who was infected was producing the food, apparently that is not the risk. It may be a risk to fellow employees, and that would be a problem under the Occupational Health and Safety Act. The risk, from my perspective, lies in transmittal of the virus on packaging, the vehicles that are transporting it, the hands of the people that are transporting it, and this is why my conclusion focuses on this particular issue. So, just to remind you that non-compliance with R638, besides anything else that I've said, the fact that they can close your facility, there can be far-reaching PR repercussions, etc. There is also this possibility that you could be prosecuted under R638 for a failure which led to the virus being distributed through your supply chain into the population. I think that this is in fact the least of your worries. I think these fines are fairly small compared to what could actually happen if it was found that through your negligence or worse, you have become a distribution means for the virus. And then, as I said, don't forget, this is only the one regulation. You still need to be looking regularly at what is happening under the Disaster Management Act, because those things are being updated frequently, almost daily, and things can change at the drop of a hat. In fact, while we're speaking, they might have published something. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Janusz. I think, as always, a very sort of entertaining but yet insightful presentation. I would definitely not like to have the job of being a driver delivering food to your home, because I think before I would even get out of the door, I would have had to have had an audit. You would have done a hygiene audit on me. So yeah, very, very interesting from that perspective. But I have to say, I had have had a similar experience. And in one case, someone was prepared, and in the other case, I was prepared with my hand sanitizer to assist the person. So yes, we have a couple of interesting questions, which I think we have time for, if that's okay with you.
Yes, of course, go ahead.
Okay, so first of all, a couple of comments from my side. I know that, as you said, the EHPs are now probably more focused on other aspects of their public health responsibility, including dealing with dead bodies. I would just a comment in the sense that I don't think that should give us an excuse in any way. It is actually time for us now as industry to step up and to take our self-regulatory responsibilities a lot more seriously, because we need to appreciate that the front line are busy with stuff that we're not busy with. Would you agree?
No, sure, of course. I mean, the pandemic adds to the current hype, and it's also almost like Listeria 2.0. When we had the listeriosis outbreak, suddenly everything else seemed to go into slow motion, and everybody focused on Listeria.
Yes.
Today, when I mention Listeria, I think people have forgotten about Listeria because everybody's focusing on coronavirus. So the reality is you need to be doing everything to comply, but now we need to additionally take steps because we're faced with a situation which realistically we don't understand. Scientists don't really understand. What we do understand is that the way to stop it is to prevent contact with people and to keep space and so on.
Yes, absolutely. But I think, in terms of the EHP, if you don't see your EHP for the next few weeks, that doesn't mean that you should take chances, as you said.
Sorry, yes, Dana, sorry. To answer that point, yes, because the problem is when you see them, you must know there's big trouble. Because if they are going to come to you now, it's because there's a real issue, because they've got so many other things to do. I would assume it's not that likely that they're going to come and inspect some minor issue which they would do in normal times. That you've got 54 chairs in your place and not 52, and you've got 2 toilets and not 3. I don't think that's going to come up now. But if there's any indication that in your area there's suddenly an increase in positive cases and they're trying to narrow down, then you must know they will come to you.
Absolutely. My only suggestion would be that please make sure that they do thoroughly sanitize themselves and apply all the hygiene measures, because if they have just come from a mortuary, we would like to at least address that potential risk when they're coming into our facilities.
Absolutely.
I liked the HIRA, the hazard identification and risk assessment that you showed us. Now, I'm sure a lot of people were trying to snap a photo of that one. Don't panic, you will be able to get access to the recording. But I think that's a very important document because it shows the process that we are supposed to follow when it comes to occupational health and safety. And I've normally seen that control measure drawn as an inverted triangle. In other words, as far as the most effective control measure, that would be elimination, down to the least effective or last resort would in fact be PPE and a policy or procedure. Yes. I think what we've obviously seen in terms of that hierarchy of control is that the Department of Labour is trying to assist companies to implement the appropriate controls within any facility that is considered an essential service. One comment I would like to make is that a suggestion that was made with regards to substitution is that you should not rotate your teams of people as far as possible, because if you do work shifts, the rotation of people could introduce an additional measure, or rather an additional factor that you may have to consider if you're trying to trace a positive infection within your environment, just from a people perspective.
Very true.
So not substituting people, trying to keep people on the same patterns at least helps us to contain. I also would like to just comment on the fact that the National Institute for Communicable Diseases issued their risk assessment, updated risk assessment this morning. So this is for health workers. Yeah, they actually updated it this morning and issued it. So this is in the healthcare setting. But what's very interesting is the number of times where they've identified that PPE is not necessary, even in a healthcare environment. So I know Minister Mkhize has said we should all wear masks, but it's just very interesting to see that there is still discrepancies and debate in terms of what PPE and when it should be worn.
Okay.
With regards to the masks, Janusz, I think we've had this discussion off air, but I think with regards to masks, just a caution, and I'm sure everyone will be applying the correct practice, coming into a facility from public transport, if I'm wearing one outside, obviously it's incumbent on the employee and the employer to make sure that there is a change of PPE from that perspective. I think that's important. It can't be the same. It can't be the same PPE that was.
Absolutely.
Okie dokes. All right. So the medical status for drivers, I think if we had to take our current systems, we would probably be doing a daily fitness check on the staff that are working in the facility. But you raise a very important point about drivers, packers that are in warehousing facilities that may be linked to our manufacturing facilities. I think that's good advice, people. I think you should extend your daily fitness checks if you haven't already done that to your drivers. Yes, Antoinette, Mr. D and Uber Eats must comply with 638. I think Janusz explained that quite clearly in terms of who would be responsible based on the transaction. What is interesting, Janusz, is I'm seeing increasing reports of deaths of food workers in the US and plants being closed as a result. I don't know if you picked up on that. Tyson Foods.
Yes.
And obviously, I think that was what you were trying to stress in terms of the importance from making sure that we're doing the right thing.
Yes, and of course those facilities were then closed, and
yes.
So besides so sad that those people died, from a food supply chain and food security and the company itself, it's just a major problem. So you want to prevent that happening so that the consequences don't follow.
Yes, I think what's really interesting is the overlap that you showed us between occupational health and safety and Regulation 638. And really it comes together on the food handler and hand hygiene and the hygiene measures that we should already have in place. I think you kept referring to health and safety, food safety, health and safety, food safety, and I think that this collaborative effort should really be taken to heart by the companies that are listening. Food safety and health and safety should be sitting around the same table at this point in time, talking about our emergency protocols.
Exactly.
The one issue I'd also like to point out, Janusz, I'm not sure what your comment would be, but what about the cleaners? So, many companies are using third-party cleaning companies, or, the cleaning is a specific task. It's not, food handlers don't necessarily do cleaning, but when it comes to surfaces and those kinds of aspects, I would think that this is absolutely critical, given the fact that, those people may actually have the most exposure to surfaces where I may have coughed and I may be positive.
So if you look at sorry, I'm not sure people can still see the slides. I went up a few slides now to a definition of food handler. And directly handles or comes into contact with packaged or unpackaged food, food equipment and utensils, or food contact surfaces. So I suppose if they're only mopping the floors, they're not considered a food handler. And then the Occupational Health and Safety Act would apply, and not R638 as such, to the person cleaning the floors. But presuming that cleaners are also cleaning food contact surfaces, well, then obviously to that extent they are food handlers as well, and everything applies to them as it would apply to any other food handler.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, Janusz, some specific issues. We have a question from Antoinette. She's saying, we know that there could be an asymptomatic infections, people that are not necessarily demonstrating all the symptoms. Would a consumer be able to make claims that they got the virus from an asymptomatic driver, for example? And how would they then, how would the burden of proof be in that regard? Any comments on that?
No, honestly, I don't think so. I need to think about the way the Consumer Protection Act is written. I think that the defect would have to be with the product, etc. So if there weren't proper controls in place with the product, that's one thing.
Yes.
If the disease was spread through a delivery driver, probably not. It's a difficult one because obviously it's a whole new situation.
Sure, but I think we have something to go back on, in the sense that we do have, we have a case of a patient who was tested positive and then who did not comply with the isolation regulation, and in that case the person was charged. So I think by implication, if you as an employer, you would need to demonstrate that you're doing everything possible to ensure that your employees are not positive, and taking the appropriate measures. If you know that someone is positive and you are not taking the appropriate measures, and a consumer is infected as a result of that, then I would think there would be consequences, but it would be, you would need to demonstrate you've done everything possible on your side.
No, I think so. But remember, the problem with the Consumer Protection Act is the Consumer Protection Act is a no-fault liability, but limited to hazards, defects, etc., with the product.
Yes, sure.
So that's why I'm distinguishing between something, because this is not a food-borne illness.
Yes.
The risk, as I said, lies potentially with transmission over the packaging.
Yes.
The debate will be, is the product defective if someone has touched the outside of the packaging? So it's not clear cut.
Yes. That links, I think, to Vince's question, because Vince is saying, with regards to patrons, should we not actually be putting more signage in place to say, you touch, you buy, and where is the responsibility or managers, liability to ensure compliance with the regulation? I know many stores have taken to covering open products, because we want to decrease the amount of consumer handling. But where would you see the liability in that regard, particularly in a retail environment?
Look, R638, the way it's been enforced of late, has in any case been not to, even if you think of bread and ready-to-eat foods and so on, they've all been covered even before this coronavirus situation. So clearly, if somebody was to contaminate with the food itself, let's say with salmonella or E. coli or something, because they're handling food and not taking it and so on, I think that the retailer or the supplier would be liable, because then they've allowed the product to become defective before it's sold. And that's what I'm saying. I think there is a difference here between a non-food-borne illness and a food-borne illness that everybody knows and understands, and we know how to prevent it, etc. But yeah, I think if a case like this went to court, different courts may have different views to some extent, depending on the judge's understanding of science.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's where the challenge is. And again, another question from Antoinette with regards to, if we know the challenge with wearing gloves. We've seen pictures of police officers in roadblocks with gloves, traffic officers, those kinds of things. If I send my driver out without gloves, knowing that it's the right thing, but I get to a delivery such as your home or any other consumer who may then say, well, wear your gloves. How do we handle the consumer's perceptions? Because I think in some cases, it's a perception, and people want to see certain measures because of their perceptions, not necessarily because of the science.
Sure. So companies that are into deliveries, and at the moment, really, that's the big companies. If we think about it, I think there are very few small companies doing deliveries. They should have some or other information document page on their website, something that when a driver arrives and he hasn't got gloves, and the people say, where's your gloves? He can say, please look on our company's website. They explain why I'm not wearing gloves. You can't expect the driver to explain it.
Yes.
But certainly a company, right, a well thought out scientific explanation as to why you don't wear gloves. Yes. And the consumer who's asking about it can go look at it.
Yes.
I think that's the only way to really deal with it. The more difficult one is what I said right in the beginning of my presentation, and that is the police, the military, whoever who will stop the driver. And in their interpretation, this guy should be wearing gloves.
Yes.
That's a real problem. They're not going to go look on his company's website.
No. And I think that's where Antoinette is suggesting that perhaps the driver should have company comms with them. A document from the company explaining why they're not using gloves, and perhaps I think also some education in that regard to assist the drivers in what is the right thing to say, how to deal with that situation.
I know what you're saying, but I can only tell, in law we call it hearsay, what I've seen in social media and in the news and so on.
Yes.
These police and soldiers who stop these people and say, wear your gloves, I don't think they're interested in reading your company comms. In their mind, they believe you should be wearing gloves.
Yeah.
And really, the only way not to get arrested at that point is to wear gloves.
Sure.
So maybe the driver should wear gloves, and when he gets to the point of delivery, he takes off the gloves. And he sanitizes his hands. I don't know. These are unusual times.
I agree. I think it's just hugely frustrating because we know that we're doing things for the right and for the wrong reason, and the complication and the confusion that this creates.
But you also got to think practically. So we're not in normal times here, and I think when this is to think practically, you obviously. The overall safety and hygiene and so on is one thing. Not being stopped in a roadblock and arrested is a different thing.
Absolutely.
And it's not going to help you that you're right if you spend 2 days in jail.
No, I hear what you're saying.
So until there's at least been 1 or 2 challenges in court where the courts have said the police were wrong, they should not have arrested this guy because he wasn't wearing gloves, it's going to be a problem. And it's also applied arbitrarily. So it's like I mentioned the story with the cooked food, where in some places they were closing down retailers that had a roast chicken. But in other places, the police themselves go and buy the roast chicken.
Only in Africa. But Janusz, I think you made an important point.
Everywhere. Anyway, yes.
Okay, you made an important point, and that is going to court to challenge some of these issues. And I think what in our previous discussion, you said that it's possibly that would be the right way for the food industry to actually deal with some of these issues, is to rather go to court and rather get a decision by the judge so that there is precedent, which at least helps the rest of us.
Sure. So there are 2 ways of doing this. And I think where we are at the moment, I don't know if you know, but the courts are literally closed except for very urgent matters, mainly relating to the regulations and enforcement of the regulations. Now, you saw yesterday the Gauteng liquor, somebody or other forum has tried to take on the system to say they should be allowed to sell liquor, and they're bringing an urgent application and so on. So it's possible. Obviously, where a driver has already been arrested or a store has already been closed, those, in a way, it provides an opportunity for very rapid legal resolution in courts. Because, not to bore the non-lawyers, I mean, Vince obviously and Yaku I see on the line, I mean, they know what I'm going to say, but the most urgent court cases, most urgent applications get thrown out of court. Courts say this is not urgent. Courts are not there to determine theoretical situations. So, but when there's an actual situation, the police have arrested Joe and Joe is sitting in a cell, that matter will be heard that day, most likely. So the opportunity to resolve the entire issue because of the situation which exists, the stores which get closed and get told you can't trade because you sold a roast chicken, that should have been taken immediately on in the High Court in the province where it happened, because ideally that would have then resolved the issue countrywide. High Court would have ruled this is not against, alternatively the High Court would have ruled it is against the disaster management regulations. Either way, it would be resolved.
Yeah, absolutely. And that would set precedent, which would just help everybody else in terms of the confusion. Two last points. One, a very important suggestion, Megan, and I would really like to take this one forward because I think what you're highlighting here is actually very, very necessary, given the fact that we have food as essential services, given the fact that internationally we are starting to see food security issues where employees are being tested positive and even deaths. Megan is suggesting that because we've got such an overload on the current viral testing, perhaps the private testing route would be the option for food handlers within food organizations, because that way it's, you know, we can just contain or a situation so much quicker than if it has to go through the public system. And I think that's a very good suggestion that, you know, we should definitely try and take up the line. The sooner we know that we have a positive employee, the sooner we can react. Janusz, your thoughts?
Yeah, so look, I mean, obviously I've seen the advertisements, for example, from Dis-Chem, that they have drive-through centers where you can go and get tested. So there are places to get tested very quickly. The question is, are you really going to test everybody every day? Because somebody, especially people coming, say, with public transport, being exposed to the public, they can be fine today and infected tomorrow, but only have symptoms in 5 days' time. So it's not the same as, for what it's worth, checking people's temperature and making them fill in a questionnaire when they arrive at work or whatever. The test as such, I think, is a much more complicated thing, and it may not be that practical.
But I think Anna's suggestion and comment is, you know, 11B says who is reported or who is suspected. She's asking, what is the right of the person in charge? You know, can they put a screening process in place? And to what extent would that screening process be acceptable within the bounds of law without being considered invasive or, you know, in terms of an infringement of my, you know, my personal rights? Where's that line?
You see, because I think you must remember all rights are balanced. So public rights versus private rights. And as we have seen, just simply with the fact that we're all locked down, our right to freedom of movement, our right to freedom of speech is being curtailed. You can't go and make a joke about coronavirus on social media, you will get arrested. So it's in times like this, I think that consideration falls away, which might be a very valid consideration up until the middle of March.
Sure.
I think now for somebody to say, but I object to being tested, well, then as an employer, you should say, well, then I can't let you onto the premises because you're a risk. I mean, we've had the Minister of Health, that NICD, etc., saying that the only way to prevent the spread is to consider everybody as potentially infected.
Yeah, so I think some practical things, as you mentioned, the screening questionnaire, which is, has to be completed. I've seen various permutations of that, one that's valid for 5 days, another one that's valid for 7 days, and then you have to complete it again. To the best of your knowledge, have you come into contact with someone who may have COVID? And the other thing that I have seen is temperature screening. In fact, I was, before lockdown, already at that stage, I was subjected to temperature scanning and using an infrared thermometer. I think that is probably the least invasive way of measuring people's temperature. I don't, there are other issues of sticking things into ears and under tongues and those kinds of things. So possibly that would be, something that could be considered. Any other ideas, Janusz, from your perspective?
No, look, I'm not a medical doctor and I can only know what I've read, but the temperature screening thing appears to be not that effective because unfortunately this virus is really, it can be spread days before somebody has symptoms, before they have a fever. So measuring a temperature will only pick up, let's call them active cases that are already at the fever stage. I don't think there's any simple way to, until technology advances and there will be some, almost like a breathalyzer test that you can blow in and it will tell you within a few minutes or instantly yes or no. Up until that point, all we can do is best guess appropriate technology usage, appropriate temperature questions, etc. Providing staff with safe transport. Let's go back a few steps.
Yeah, there we go. That's an elimination factor or a substitution factor, as you were talking about earlier, in terms of the criteria for control.
Yeah, I mean, you can do whatever you want at your factory door. If your employees have to arrive by public transport from who knows where and they have to change taxis twice and be exposed in public areas and so on, knowing that they can already be spreading the virus before they show symptoms. So being able to provide a safe transport, which you, to the best of your knowledge, know is safe, already eliminates or reduces that risk tremendously.
Absolutely, or one of the risks. I see Karen Goodburn from the Chilled Foods Association. Hi, Karen, so good to have you with us. She's definitely saying temperature screening not always helpful because you have, as you said, the pre or the asymptomatic carriers. So it's not always, it's not a reliable and not always a reliable means. Exactly. Thank you. Yeah. Janusz, any final words, any sort of words of encouragement to the people that are working out there while you and I are safely in our home offices, in our pajamas?
I would almost want to say that the people that are actually working in the food industry are probably least at risk because the food industry has always been highly focused on hygiene, cleanliness, reduction of risk, food safety culture, and all of those things permeate into understanding how to prevent the spread of this virus. There are certain things that they can't avoid. You have to sometimes go into a public space. You can't avoid that. But I think that from a food safety, from an employee worker safety perspective, those in the food industry are probably in one of the best positions to be at this stage.
I think what it does. What I think is important is the fact that we, of any sector other than possibly healthcare, we should know how to wash our hands. We should know how to practice proper hand hygiene. We should know how to sneeze into our elbows. Of course, we should be doing that already because, that's part of, part of the requirement that we should be doing. I think we do understand that masks and gloves are not actually the right, the right measures because there's training associated with that, how we put them on, how we take them off. They're not always effective in low temperature environments. We understand those implications. So we should be well versed in the requirements. But I think that an important comment, you made an important point about food safety culture, and I think two things that I think we must stress at this time, and that is the importance that food safety must be paramount. we cannot avoid to take any risks at this point in time with the public health strain that we currently have on our resources. And then I think secondly, the need for management to be talking to staff. You know, people will be, I'm talking employees now, they're coming from home environments where family members are in lockdown, where they are stressed. You know, there are many aspects that can be playing on their minds psychologically. We need to rely on integrity, and it's good leadership and face-to-face leadership, you know, encouraging staff and working with staff that I think will build a strong culture, not only for food safety, but that will actually get us through COVID-19 as a strong team within the food industry.
Sure, and I think obviously once all of this has passed, all the lessons learned will remain and actually provide for a safer food system for the country. Absolutely, going forward. Let's hope that. Let's hope, and that is the case. Janusz, thank you so much again for your very generous time. For those of you that are on the line with us, thank you so much. Once again, thank you so much for your assistance and for your insight. We really do appreciate it. Have a good day, everyone, and stay home. Thank you. Thanks.
Thanks.
Bye.